slide and start the recording. Thank you, Christina Cook. So my name is Julia Isaacs, and I am the co-lead with Kelly Kearns of the monthly meeting team. And we welcome you to this October 2nd meeting. To help us, especially those that have been dealing with technical difficulties, let's take 2 deep breaths together. I'll take a second deep breath. So on the right, I share a photo taken yesterday of, I believe it's oak trees in front of the Upper Yahara River looking towards Cherokee Marsh. For those of you that know the Madison area, this is from the dog park. And on the left, I share a map showing in the 1800s, about 1800, the different land holdings of different tribes in Wisconsin. And I acknowledge that I am on Ho-Chunk land. You can see it down there in the southern part of Wisconsin. The Ho-Chunks were forcibly removed from the land in 1832. Now I realize we've been doing land acknowledgements for about 3.5 years because we started right at the beginning of the pandemic. And we want to make sure it doesn't become rote. And so one thing that occurs to me is we want to move our land acknowledgements beyond words into action, and to let cultural ways, songs, and stories guide us. And this is a quote from the Ho-Chunk website: guide us with values of how to respect the land, the animals, and how to live in balance with nature. So I'm sharing the idea that just as the Ho-Chunk have stewarded the land for centuries and centuries and centuries, one way to honor that stewardship is to continue our own stewardship of the land. Let's move on to the next slide. I just want to give an overview and really welcome everybody, particularly people who are new. If you're new and brave, put in the chat, hi, I'm so-and-so from so-and-so. We want to welcome everyone, and I want to publicly state that we want 350 Wisconsin's public meetings to be welcoming and supportive for all people, regardless of background or identity. And I think Susan's going to drop our code of conduct in the chat. I'll just say these meetings, so we have three goals. First, we want to learn from our main speakers. I'm really excited. In a little bit, I'll introduce Nikki, who will introduce Seth, that we have a great speaker about communicating to win your climate campaign. A second purpose of this meeting is to just share all the wonderful activities that are going on with our different teams and opportunities for you to participate. And finally, last but certainly not least, we use these meetings to extend a warm welcome to newcomers. One way you can get to know us is from hearing what's happening in the different teams, but we also will have a newcomers welcome at the end of the meeting, and we welcome you to stay for that. And at the end of the meeting, for those who are not newcomers, we have 4 special breakout teams today, where we'll be meeting in 4 groups to work in team ways on this cool action communication tool that Seth is going to introduce to us. But that's at the end of the meeting. So let me now turn to Nikki Darga, who is who's on the staff of 350. She's our volunteer engagement coordinator and also our business administrator. Nikki, do you want to come up and introduce our main speaker for tonight?
Yes, absolutely. So very happy to introduce Seth Jensen for tonight, who is going to be talking us through the Spectrum of Allies tool. Seth has been active with 350 Wisconsin from the very beginning. Back in August of 2011, he was actually arrested in the protests led by Bill McKibben against the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. And Seth credits the feminist movement for teaching him the value of community-based organizing and he is currently the co-lead of the Divest and Defund team. And he also bounces his time between roles as a climate activist and a massage therapist. So happy to introduce Seth and let him take over.
Thank you, Nikki. Before we get into the meat of tonight's meeting, I would like to see a show of hands, either your physical hand or your digital hand, which you can put up in Zoom, of those who were at last month's meeting when we heard about energy burden. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So I see a couple hands. Those who have your hands raised, you might remember hearing a few times one of our speakers saying, know your audience, know your audience, know your audience. And that's still ringing in my ears very much. It has a ring of truth to it. It has for a long time, actually going back long time ago when we had a strategic planning retreat and our own Susan Millar kicked that off with something very similar about the importance of knowing our audiences. And you're going to hear that a number of times throughout this presentation. So I'll just prepare you now, be prepared to be told to know your audience. And let's go to the next slide. So while I found that to be very true, I also realize that there's a truth to the fact that knowing that something needs to be done and knowing how to do it are two often very different things. And this is the dilemma that I run into, is that I know, especially in order to make significant progress on climate, it's important to know your audience. I don't consider myself very good at actually doing it, at knowing necessarily who I most need to reach, which is important before you think about what you most need to say. But there are some tools out there in the organizing world that have made it easier, and I'm going to share a couple today. You already know, some of you already know and use one of them. You know it as the spectrum of allies. I actually have found it so useful for communications work that in my mind, it's called the spectrum of audiences. And I often just automatically revert to that term. So please forgive me if that happens today. Before we go to the next slide, I just want to say that while this tool of the spectrum is useful throughout a lot of activist work, it's most useful in the context of a campaign. So we'll be doing a little bit of campaign recap. But before that happens, I'm going to ask our slide advancer to go to the next slide and to, for those of you in the audience, to, I guess, reminisce a bit, maybe take a deep breath. And what comes to your mind when you hear this word 2011, when you reflect on that date? Is it something that was happening in your life, a number of things, perhaps something happening in the world? I invite you, if you feel moved, to put some things in the chat. Don't censor yourself a whole lot, just your recollections. And while you are recollecting, I'm going to ask that we go to the next slide. And I'm going to advance my notes a little bit. So I'm going to share one memory from that year. And for it to make sense, I'm just going to have to issue a little reminder that while there was a lot going on in Wisconsin, that was also the year that in which it seemed as though the Western United States was going to get a brand new pipeline, stretching all the way from Alberta, Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm of course referring to the Keystone XL or KXL, and it was a pipeline that this Calgary-based company, TransCanada, really wanted to build. And it had those words XL because it really would have been extra large and would have carried a lot of oil from the tar sands oil fields in Alberta down to the Gulf of Mexico, to ports in the Gulf of Mexico for eventual shipping to the global market and burning. And this was actually so much oil that climate scientists were saying that to build KXL would be the equivalent of setting off a carbon bomb. And as you might imagine, this was setting off a lot of alarm bells throughout the climate movement, which was a much, much smaller movement back then, much less influential. And in fact, in many ways, it was in its infancy. So nevertheless, 350 and some allied organizations did manage to put out a call for folks to come to Washington, D.C. over the course of 2 weeks. There were daily sit-ins in front of the White House. People responded to the call. This was around the Labor Day holiday period. And I'm going to ask that we go to the next slide. So why the White House? Well, TransCanada, again, the company that wanted to build this pipeline, they really had almost everything at that point that they needed in order to do so. And many people were saying that KXL was unstoppable. It was unstoppable. It was unstoppable. Those were actually the words that were ringing through a lot of our heads during that time period. And it was difficult to act otherwise. But TransCanada did not quite have everything that they needed. They needed a permit because this pipeline would have crossed the US-Canadian border. The Obama administration, more specifically the State Department, essentially had to sign off on it. So essentially, President Obama, president at the time, had the power to, with the stroke of a pen, bring KXL to a halt. So there was some reason to believe that he might do this, but truthfully, we, at least I, did not have a whole lot of hope that he would do so. He had made some wonderful campaign pronouncements on the trail about the healing of the oceans, ending the tyranny of big oil, but as president, he'd really by that point passed up nearly every opportunity to actually do something to end the tyranny of big oil. And those who wanted to stop KXL were running out of time. His administration was expected to reach a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline by the end of the year 2011. Let's go to the next slide. So sit-ins around Labor Day of 2011, and then a decision kind of, sort of, in 2011. The State Department said that they wanted to not reject and not approve the application for this permit, but to review it some more, and in essence, kicking the can down the road. So this is actually my big memory from 2011, was the moment when this announcement came through. It was very unexpected. As I said, the idea that KXL was unstoppable was echoing. There was not really a lot of hope when we did those sit-ins, like just enough to make people decide, well, we'll try this. So even though it wasn't everything that we wanted, getting the word that there was even a delay in TransCanada's plan was just like pure elation, an amazing high. Like it meant that maybe, just maybe, we could defeat this thing, diffuse this carbon bomb. So as all sorts of elation does, it settled into the cold, hard reality that in order to stop this pipeline, it was going to take an actual long-term campaign. So when I say that, what I mean was there was a realization settling in among 350 and the other groups committed to continuing to oppose and hopefully stop this pipeline, that demonstrations were going to have to spread across the country to federal buildings and other sites where an action could exert pressure on President Obama to ultimately deny that permit, to bring the pipeline to a halt. And it was looking at that point like it could take months. Next slide, please. And in fact, it took years. Not until 2015 did Obama make the decisive announcement that he was going to reject the KXL. Many of you watching tonight know that even that wasn't really the end of the story, but that's where this story is going to end, sort of. So you might be asking yourself, how did all those people who got involved with the No KXL campaign make that dramatic shift from being on the brink of defeat and a lot of despair in 2011 to really tasting the fruits of a very significant victory in 2015? Well, again, that term, know your audience, know your audience, know your audience. It was important that No KXL was operating from within a campaign, long-term targeted set of actions. But many of those actions were really designed to reach a certain segment of the population. So for instance, here in Madison, Wisconsin, as we were heading into 2012, which was an election year, the year that Obama was running for re-election, one of the demonstrations that we did was to actually go to Obama campaign offices, field offices, and we'd bring these big balloons, we'd alert the press. At the actual demonstration, we would theatrically release the air, and our press spokesperson would talk about how our enthusiasm for Obama was really deflating because of his kind of waffling, lack of decisive words to come out against the Keystone Pipeline, keeping us guessing, et cetera, et cetera. It got very good press, got on the evening news, and perhaps more importantly than those who are reached on the evening news, that message, we believe, have reason to believe, really filtered throughout the whole Obama campaign apparatus, the whole operation, and really communicated to people who we more or less thought were a sympathetic audience, that there needed to be action, that our support couldn't just be taken for granted. Let's move on to the next slide. So those actions could have been done in a way that alienated people and turned potential allies into opponents. But in fact, it doesn't look like that happened. It looks like those well-designed demonstrations really won over people who were in agreement more or less with us to actually taking action to do so. And this is how much of the No KXL campaign operated, how many of their actions operated throughout those 4 years from 2011 until 2015. No KXL didn't put a whole lot of energy into winning over friends of the fossil fuel industry, climate deniers, or their aligned politicians holding office. The effort was really much more targeted on potential allies and getting them to step up and take action, especially in the beginning, really creating a space where those who wanted to do something about climate but maybe didn't have a place to go, did have a place to go. I think we can go to the next slide. So just as a little campaign tip, where No KXL found itself is actually the place where a lot of movements, especially climate activists, find themselves. So I'm talking about a situation where a decision maker claims to be on your side or says all the right things, you might even say offers lip service to a cause, but is not actually demonstrating that with their actions. And this is not a new story. Alice Paul, as many of you may know from the Women's Suffrage Party, was in a very similar place in 1918, 1919, 1920, when there was a real push to finally get suffrage passed. But Wilson, the president at the time, was stalling. The Women's Suffrage Party decided then again that a bunch of sit-ins in front of the White House was really what was called for to both move Wilson, the target of the campaign, but also to really kind of shift as many people who were sympathetic to the cause of women's suffrage into actually doing something about it. Yeah. So that is the place where a lot of movements find themselves and campaigners find themselves. But that's not always the case. So with this slide, welcome to Bank Like Appalachia Matters, another climate campaign. It's similar to KXL in that it played out over roughly the same time period. It actually achieved success in 2015. It's a little different in the sense that No KXL kind of had to be put together, mapped out somewhat on the fly. Banking Like Appalachia Matters, the organizers of that campaign had a little bit more space and time for strategic planning, and they used it to really good effect. So BLAM was developed by a faith-based environmental group in Philadelphia who wanted to do something meaningful for the cause of climate justice. And they decided that that meaningful thing would be making demands of PNC Bank, which at that time was a major funder of mountaintop removal coal mining, a really devastating practice on multiple levels, and not just climate, but it was really horrible for the land, the air and water, particularly in the Appalachian region. So the BLAM campaigners decided that they would back up their demands with action, and their demands, like with most campaigns, were geared towards a specific target who had the power to make the decision to make a difference. So in this case, that was the CEO and the top management of PNC Bank. Many of you here tonight who are involved with our local Chase campaigning will hear a lot of echoes in this example, and there are those. Let's go to the next slide. So there were many actions like this as part of the BLAM campaign, many occupations of PNC banks, but there were also events where they crashed PNC PR occasions. Sometimes they would go to shareholders meetings, but in all, it took years and about 125 actions before PNC finally gave in to the demands of the campaign. Yeah, so here you can see the organizers with BLAM holding a kind of a service of mourning for the mountains that have been lost to mountaintop removal coal mining, but also very crucially holding PNC responsible for that as an entity that was making loans to a lot of mountaintop removal coal mining companies. At the time, PNC was really casting itself as what they called the greenest bank in the business, is how they put it, greenest bank in the business. And they probably would have convinced people that that was true, but with every action that BLAM did, they really undercut that PR campaign. Let's go to the next slide. So this is an example where getting the message out to more neutral people was kind of the decisive part of this campaign. PNC was trying to promote this image of themselves as a green bank. BLAM was essentially telling the truth, pointing out how they were not of green bank. And it was effective enough that at least PNC believed that people were being won over, that their PR campaign was being, I guess, lack of a better word, sabotaged enough by Blam actions that it was better to just drop these mountaintop removal coal mining companies than try and put up with these actions that were having a really devastating effect on their image. So, although they were kind of working different audiences, but with both Blam and NoKXL, it wasn't an accident that they were reaching the people that they were reaching. These were the result of conscious choices of the campaign designers as they were deciding not only who to target and what they wanted that target to do, but as they were putting together their actions. They were very, very conscious of who they were reaching out to again, go back to last meeting and even before that. They knew their audience, they knew their audience, they knew the audience that they wanted to reach. Next slide, please. But of course, very crucially, they were operating as part of a campaign, as part of an operation that had a goal in mind, that knew of a decision maker that could give them that goal, that could make the right choice. And they were committed to doing action after action after action to put pressure on that decision maker. So what I'm describing is essentially the bones of a campaign. There is a lot to good campaign design. And in this presentation, we are very much, well, I don't want to say scratching the surface, because what we're doing is kind of just getting at the bare bones structure of a campaign, which is important in order to know your audience. Campaigns have, in my experience, a certain anatomy. Once you launch them and start working on them, they become almost like living entities that take on a life of their own. They're unpredictable, and they have to adapt to changing circumstances. But at their deepest level, one thing that, again, they all have in common is this matter of a group that is working on putting pressure on a decision maker to make a decision that would be meaningful. So with Obama canceling the KXL, denying it the permit, with PNC CEO passing a policy that would prohibit funding for mountaintop removal coal miners. We're close to the end of this presentation, even though, yes, we're close to the end of this presentation. But before we go on, if they haven't already, our behind the scenes wonderful tech people are going to be putting a bunch of links into the chat. For those who are interested in resources on kind of fleshing out and putting more muscle on a campaign, or even really a singular action. So if you want to go kind of beyond the bare bones. But as we get into this other tool, the spectrum of allies, the main thing that we want to keep in mind is just these bare bones, that a campaign, again, has a target, someone who can make a decision of significance, their actions putting pressure on that target to get that target to make the right choice. Often campaigns come about because of a belief that without this kind of pressure, the target is going to actually make the wrong choice, which probably would have happened both in the NoKXL example and the Banking Like Appalachia Matters example. Julia, how much more time do we have? Just trying to decide whether to skip over one slide or not.
I mean, we're cutting into Q&A time, but see if you can wrap up in the next 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes. Okay, so I think I will have us go to the next slide, because this is kind of getting into more of the muscle of a campaign, but it is somewhat important muscle that we really want to include. So often campaigns have not just one target, but more secondary targets as well. So this was very apparent in the Banking Like Appalachia Matters campaign. The CEO and top management were those who had the ultimate decision-making authority, but there was also, as with most banks, a board of directors that had a fair amount of authority, more than a lot of boards, but also had access to the CEO and top management. So a lot of Banking Like Appalachia Matters were actions happened whenever these board of directors would appear in public. And the idea was putting pressure on them is an effective way to put pressure on the target. One thing about targets is they always have proper names, pretty much, or in almost all cases have proper names. And backing up just a little bit, they can be influenced by swaying audiences or social groups, segments of the population. And it's very important to do that in the course of a campaign and when planning actions, but they're not quite the same thing. So when we get into like groups of people, names of groups of people, then we're talking more about audiences as opposed to targets. And I think I'm going to ask our slide person to go maybe 2 slides in. Yeah, and then we'll go back to that other one. So why would we want to pitch our messaging, design our actions, run our campaigns so that they reach certain audiences? Why wouldn't we just like try to win over the general public? Well, one reason, I mean, besides the examples I gave, is that our opposition, especially the agenda of the pipeline builders, they are doing this very, very well. And I'm sure a number of people on this call, especially if you traveled to Minnesota a couple years ago in the Line 5 resistance camps or are following what's going on in Michigan or even here lately, can come up with many examples beyond just the ones in this slide of how Enbridge is so horrifically but expertly laying groundwork, not just physically for their pipelines, but laying it through the quote unquote court of public opinion, how they are planting stories, really doing targeted outreach to various segments of the population, not just in the ways we have on this slide, but through sometimes very grassroots means. So some of you may remember that in Michigan last year, I'm sorry, 2 years ago, when the Whitmer administration was launching a legal challenge to Line 5, which runs a pipeline owned by Enbridge that goes through part of Michigan. Part of the way Enbridge and aligned groups tried to resist that was by going to like public government buildings, doing demonstrations where they would lay hard hats out on the stairs of these public buildings to represent all the jobs that would be lost if Line 5 were to be shut down, as the Whitmer administration was fighting for. So now let's go back a slide. So here it is, finally, the spectrum of allies, a way of thinking about audiences, a way of thinking about who do we want to reach. Just repeating one more time, this is most useful in the context of a campaign. So I think even though we're a little ways in, I'm gonna try and sort of honor the ethos of the Banking Like Appalachia Matters campaign. And just have a few seconds of silence for folks to, I'll talk about it in a minute, but a few seconds to consider our work in 350 Wisconsin in light of this. The seconds are up. But I will just say we will have more time to consider this in breakout groups. So just giving an example of a group, again, that had a campaign, Banking Like Appalachia Matters. And when it came time to actually plan the actions that made up that campaign, had to think about, well, who are we most, trying to reach? And more importantly, who are we most trying to move? They had the active allies to consider. Again, you saw them in the picture of those occupying the bank. They had more passive allies to consider. Those would be people who agree that banks should not fund climate destroying, community destroying practices like mountaintop removal coal mining, but weren't necessarily doing anything to back that belief up with action. More neutral people, those who were the people that they ultimately decided to pitch a lot of their actions towards, those who just weren't aware for the most part that banks had a big role to play in climate change and in the fossil fuel industry. Passive opponents, those who are like, yes, banks should loan as much money as possible to coal companies, to the fossil fuel industry, but weren't necessarily doing much to put that belief into action. And active opponents who could most best be represented by the coal companies, probably, who are receiving those loans. Let's go to the very last slide. So before planning actions, whether that takes the form of a street demonstration or even a letter writing campaign or even a post on social media that you want to influence, it can often be very powerful to consider who are you most wanting to persuade, or are you most wanting to move? Are you wanting to convert a passive ally into an active ally? Would it be more effective to convert someone kind of middle of the road, on the fence, neutral, into agreeing with your cause, whether or not they actually back that up with action? And I say before you're about to plan a demonstration or maybe a letter writing campaign, but these are very helpful things to consider, like say after you've gone to a demonstration, or maybe after you've seen your letter post or published in the paper. Like, who do you think you reached? Whether or not you had a specific audience in mind to begin with, to do some of that reflection. And finally, I just think this visual is very helpful to keep in mind when you're, like, say, making phone calls, out there handing out leaflets, maybe meeting with managers of banks, as some of us are, doing things kind of sort of being like the foot soldiers of the climate movement, doing things where you could potentially encounter some hostility and are almost guaranteed to encounter a certain level of indifference, of remembering that there are many examples like Banking Like Appalachia Mattered, and No KXL, where incredible changes were made, where victories were achieved for the climate, where emissions were cut down, because the organizers and the campaigns had a good sense of who was in their audience and who was not necessarily in their audience, who they didn't need to spend a whole lot of time and energy worrying about. They could accept that it was very, very important to reach and shift certain key audience members, but that the person who just said, I don't want your leaflet, or you're crazy, and just let that go and move on. And on that note, I believe it's more than time to move on to the next part of this monthly meeting.
Well, thank you, Seth, for sharing the spectrum of allies. I know that I often think that we're trying to move people from passive allies to, so many people care about climate change and aren't doing anything about it. We're trying to move people from passive allies to active allies. Next slide, Christina. So what we're going to do now, I seem to have dropped my slide, which says team updates. My apologies. But Maddie, you can see this is your slide. Oh, so this is now, we're moving from hearing what Seth, thank you, Seth. We're now going to move to hear about 6 to 8 quick updates, and then we'll go back to using the spectrum of allies and having our newcomers break out. So, Maddie.
Alrighty. Thank you, Julia. So the MG&E and WPL or Alliant Energy cases are still underway. Last month, we informed monthly meeting attendees about opportunities to testify in public hearings and submit written comments on the MG&E and WPL cases. And thank you to everyone who participated in that. There have been over 1,200 public comments between those two cases, which is unprecedented participation for the Public Service Commission. Public comments help influence the PSC's final decisions and have also resulted in a few changes to Alliant's net metering proposal in favor of rooftop solar. And so while the public comment period for MG&E is over, there are still 2 days left to submit a comment on the WPL case, and you don't need to be an Alliant Energy customer to comment. So go ahead and click the link in the chat or use the QR code to see our blog post with key updates and instructions to submit a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. And I have to say that the blog helped me submit comments to MG&E, which was due last Wednesday. So it's a very good blog. I recommend it to people. Next slide. Alex, is this you or Brittany?
This slide's me. Okay. Okay, so for our tar sands team, we have gotten some new yard signs printed, which is super exciting. And we have a bunch of them now, and we'd like to get them distributed all over to help raise awareness of Line 5 and just get the word out there to reject the pipeline reroute. Should I drop the link in the chat, or I'm not sure if like someone was going to do that.
I think you'll have to. I don't think I have it. Thank you. So you'll drop.
Yes, I could do that.
Next, it is a beautiful sign. Next slide. So I'm going to take off my monthly meeting team co-lead hat and put on my divest and defund team co-lead hat. And you may recognize Alex right there holding the banner. So we are looking for people to hold banners outside the bank, just like Alex did on July 29th. Because we're doing peaceful sit-ins inside banks. And this is very related to stopping Line 5, because we're telling Chase to stop funding fossil fuel projects, and we're particularly telling them to stop lending funds to Enbridge for building Line 5. We're going to do this on Saturdays in October. I'm not announcing publicly what Saturday, because I don't want the bank to not let us in. So if you want to hold a banner, just write divest.defund, just write to us at 350wisconsin.org. Or if you know me or Jessica or Seth or Judy Stadler, the 4 of us are helping lead the outside portions of these inside actions. And there are other people on this call who are leading the inside ones. So we would love to get some more banner holders. And there'll be some tabling help needed and some leafleting help. So if you get in touch with us, we'll get back to you. Next slide.
Okay. This looks like the Art Collective. I just want to say briefly that we are still looking for a storage spot for our Chariot of the Great Turning, which is what we call this magnificent piece of art. We're hoping to store it whole, with minus the earth ball. So it's 7.5 feet tall. I'm reading statistics here. 7.5 feet tall, and 7.5 feet wide. But if that's too large for a space, we can disassemble it and just store the wheels. But it would be really incredibly helpful if we could store it whole. So if anyone has any ideas, any suggestions, please contact Russ Bennett. And I'm going to put his email in the chat right now. Thank you very much.
Next, how many people here have seen that great Chariot of Turning? Just, yeah, if you have. It's so cool. Kristen Clark, I should be saying who these people are to help newcomers. Sorry, that was Diane Brackharsh, who is co-lead of the Art Collective team. And I had called on Alex Getch, who was co-lead of the Tar Sands team. I'm now calling on Kristen Clark, who is our development manager.
Hi everyone, so happy to be joining you all tonight for this meeting. I just want to do a quick announcement of our Giving Tuesday. Save the date, it is November 28th this year. And Giving Tuesday is always the Tuesday following Thanksgiving, so it's Thanksgiving, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and then we get to Giving Tuesday, and we are going to have a really awesome fun community celebration at Garver Feed Mill. It's where the event was held last year. And it is also just like a fun year in review event for everyone in the organization to come to, talk to each other, have some fun. Oh, yes, I forgot Small Business Saturday. Can't forget my days here in that week. And during that time, we have a silent auction as to help with our end of year donations on our donations for Giving Tuesday. And all of the money that we raise for Giving Tuesday and our end of the year campaign just goes to support all the incredible work of the organization. And so with that, if you have anything you want to donate towards the silent auction, such as art, a handmade craft, a service, or there's a business that you really personally enjoy and you think maybe someone would enjoy one of their products or a gift card or a service, whatever it may be, if you want to donate anything, we invite you to do so and would be so grateful for your support in that way. There's a tiny URL to fill out the form to do so. I'm also dropping that link in the chat right now. And then also, if you are interested in helping volunteering the day of Giving Tuesday, helping put the event together to make it run seamlessly for everyone who comes, you can also email Mariah because her email is less complicated than mine. It's just mariah@350wisconsin.org. And that's all I have to say about Giving Tuesday for now. We'll have another even more fun announcement next month as we get closer, but just a nice save the date, November 28th. We hope to see you all there. Now, the Oldbrook Beer Garden. We got rained out on our original date and we moved it to our rain date, and then we got rained out on our rain date. So we got lots of rain. And so now we have it rescheduled, knock on wood, for hopefully the last time for October 14th, which is a Saturday from 4 to 7 p.m. That's not this Saturday, but the following Saturday in the evening at Oldbrook Beer Garden on Lake Monona. It's going to be a really fun time. If you registered for the previous events that got rained out, you are still registered. If you did not register because you couldn't make it to the previous two dates, we had to change the date, and hopefully you can come to this one. So you can register for that just by going on our website, or I know it's been a lot of the different email blasts and news articles and on social media as well. So that's all I have for announcements.
Thank you, Kristen. You're no longer our newest staff member. It's that's no longer have that that thing. So Nikki, are you making this announcement since Emily is having internet problems?
Yes, yes, I am. So Emily would normally be making this announcement, but she is unfortunately unable to connect to Zoom. She is trying desperately. So here I am. And one thing we just wanted to bring up for everybody is that we have a new campaign team coming to 350 Wisconsin. This campaign team was born of the agricultural policy and practice team, but is expanding to work on that and other sustainable and regenerative agriculture, forest stewardship, and community-led natural climate solutions. So there is a lot of opportunity here. We're very excited to have this new team start to flourish and become its own campaign. There are upcoming events for this specific team. So there is a webinar coming up to talk more about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a very large piece of legislation that can influence everybody, not just farmers. And this webinar is to hear more about that, to hear more about how the Farm Bill impacts everyone and your life, and what we can do to make it a more sustainable and beneficial piece of legislation as it's passing. There's also a film screening coming up. I know Mike Friend mentioned in the chat when we got here that he likes to do film screenings in the fall. That's because they're coming up and a part of the team that he's a part of. So Kiss the Ground is happening on October 9th, and then Ants and the Grasshopper on October 15th. And if you want more information, I'm not exactly sure where they're located right now. I need to remember where that is. But that information is available somewhere. We'll figure it out and put it in the chat and make sure everybody knows where it is. So I think one of those is in Mount Horeb. I could be incorrect. Mike, thank you for showing up in the chat there. Both are in Mount Horeb, and we'll make sure that that information is easy to find. If you would like to learn more and join the team, there's a couple of different email addresses here as it is building out.
And Nikki, in your role as volunteer engagement coordinator, could you share with us who is the volunteer of the month this month?
Yes, so speaking of our ag policies and practice group, our volunteer of the month is Mike Friend. Yay, Mike! I know Mike is here. He's been commenting in the chat here. So a little bit of background on Mike. Mike was a co-lead of the Dane County working group of the Community Climate Solutions team and really spearheaded the agricultural policy and practice team that is now becoming its own thing. He also has, a huge interest in agriculture, and you may have seen him at a recent monthly meeting because he has spoken about sustainable agriculture at a monthly meeting as well. He has been instrumental in growing that team, organizing farm visits and film screenings. And that's not all he does either, which is pretty incredible. I mean, he was also really instrumental in helping us get the funding to work on the Farm Bill more. And he also is involved in our justice, equity, diversity and inclusion process. He has phone banked for tar sands, and on top of all of that is incredibly pleasant to work with. Just such a joy to talk to. And I remember I was tabling with him recently, and he was making his own rope out of hemp plant, I think. I don't remember. Or no, a specific plant. Mike, you'll have to correct me. But he is just incredibly wonderful to work with. So very, very happy to recognize him here today. Thank you so much, Mike, for everything that you're doing. And we will be very, very sad to see him go. He has been living in Illinois for a long time, or for a while now. So he's been sort of transitioning a lot of his leadership to other people within the ag policy group. But we are so thankful for everything you have done and are continuing to do right now.
Well, thank you, Nikki, and thanks for everyone for sharing those updates. I think the next slide, I'll make the last announcement, which is that we're having another monthly meeting the first Monday in November. It will be like this one on Zoom only. We're excited that Pete Notek and Ann Steinberg from Climate Safe Pensions for Wisconsin will be speaking to us about what climate safe pensions for Wisconsin is. I think with that, we can stop the recording. I do want to welcome no, you can go back up one slide. Sorry, I'll stop the recording, but I just want to say we have in case you haven't figured out, we have a lot of teams, very active teams. These are the teams that meet on Monday nights, and please contact the team leads if you want to join any of those teams. And the next slide shows we have more teams and who to contact if you want to join, or if you don't even join, but just want to know like more about what they do. I can tell you that the team leads are always happy to chat and try to answer questions. But we also can answer your questions by Nikki Darga, our volunteer engagement coordinator, sort of knows what all the teams are doing.